Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Good Dram Show with me, Chris Goodrum. Right, okay. This is actually the first week in a long time I hadn't actually figured out quite what I was going to do in this week's episode. Got any tastings planned, and I thought, okay, let's go back to the A to Z of Scottish distilleries. So we get to the letter O. Not exactly an awful lot of choice there, is it? It's Oban or nothing, and I have no samples of Oban. I don't deal with a distillery, and I thought I'm not going to go and buy 3 bottles of whiskey just to do an episode of the show with. Certainly not as relatively expensive as Oban, certainly not as expensive as the Distillers Edition, which is just ridiculously overpriced, as is all the Distillers Editions of the various Diageo distilleries. So I kind of thought, well, let's think a little bit outside of the box. How about Old Pulteney? I mean, yes, all right, so technically the distillery is Pulteney, it's P, it should be further down the line, and I thought, so I said to the distillery rep, I said, look, I've done the 12, I've done, the 17, 21, etc., and I've probably done a couple of other ones. How about getting hold of me a sample of new make, some younger spirit from the cask, all that kind of stuff? And the answer was no. So I know some distilleries are a bit funny about releasing their new make spirit, but basically Pulteney shoved it down in flames and said, we don't release stuff until it's ready for releasing. So, okay, fair enough. So that kind of left me with a little bit of a quandary. So there's no O at the end of the day, so we're going straight on to P instead. And well, I could have done Port Ellen. I think I might have a couple of samples of Port Ellen, but that's not going to make a particularly interesting episode of the show. Petit Vase, haven't seen a bottling of that in donkey's years. So Port Dundas, why not? I've done an episode of the show on Port Dundas before, and I love, as you know, the old grain whiskies. I love them. So I went rummaging in the samples, and I got half a dozen damn good samples to show you, all from Hunter Lang's Sovereign range, and at an age that grain whisky should be. So none of this under 21 years old business. Oh no, 25-year-old is the minimum that we have here, and this is going to be a really interesting tasting because I've never tasted Port Dundas, vertical almost, I suppose, of this kind of age, and so I'm really looking forward to this, and I think this will be a really interesting episode of the show. So not an awful lot to say, really, to be honest with you. I've already done an episode of the show on Port Dundas, so I don't need to go into any waffling about the distillery itself. So let's introduce this afternoon's little lineup. Right, okay, so like I said, we're kicking off with a properly aged grain, none of this under 21-year-old malarkey. This is 25 years old. It was distilled in February of 1990, bottled in May of 2015, bottled at 51.9%, like I said, part of the Hunter Lang Sovereign range, and for those of you who like to know, the cask number was HL 11593. Second bottling we'll be looking at is a 27-year-old, so another couple of years on that. This was distilled in October of 1988, bottled in November of 2015 at 56.7%, and the cask reference is HL 12135. Now, the nice thing about today's spread of ages is that they're nicely spread. I mean, in the past, I've done episodes on grain, and I've gone sort of like, young, haven't got a 30-year-old, straight up to a 40-year-old. No, not today. Today we have a 35-year-old. This was distilled in January of 1978, bottled in July of 2013 at 58.1%, and the cask reference was HL 9864. Fourth sample we'll be looking at is another 30-year-old. This one's 36 years old. I did have a couple of other ones as well, but I thought let's go for 2 20s, 2 30s, and 2 slightly more older than that. So the 36-year-old was again distilled in sometime of 1978, I don't know exactly when, bottled in April of 2014 at 58.7%, and the cask reference is HL 10431. And then we get on to the two rather older bottlings. This is a 40-year-old. This was distilled in 1974, November, bottled in September of last year at 47.6%, cask reference HL11844. And finally, the one I'm looking forward to, the 50-year-old. This was distilled in June of 1965, before I was born. Bottled in October of last year, 2015, at 41.2%, and the cask reference is HL11838. So, like I say, I think it's really interesting. Really looking forward to this, and hopefully we'll see the progression, the evolution of the spirit. I mean, as you may or may not know, Port Dundas was renowned for actually having not only column stills but pot stills as well. So, unlike some of the other distilleries which would have just the grain, not the grain, the column stills, you got your one style. Obviously with Port Dundas it had the option of the sort of the light style distilled in the column stills or the slightly heavier style in the pot. So it'll be interesting to see if we pick up any of those characters as we go along. So anyway, I think that's enough of that. Let's kick off with the young one then, shall we? Right, okay, so let's see what the 25-year-old gives us on the nose then, shall we? Now, yes, it's 25 years old, but it has a freshness, a crispness, which is just what you get from grain. Like I said, you know, grain doesn't really come into its own until it's at least 18, 21, and this has got young grain, but some lovely mature oak underneath, some nutty vanilla, really fresh, really crisp. So I'm guessing this has probably come from the column still. There's a little bit of granulated sugar sweetness, some lovely vanilla oak coming through now, a little bit of toffee. I mean, this is the wonderful thing about grain whiskies. You know, they just have this ability to age. They pick up the oak quite nicely, and there's a little bit of cigar smoke now, just a sort of faint whiff, and they can be really complex. Yeah, that's lovely. I mean, yeah, there's not a great deal of dried fruits. It hasn't got into that kind of stage in its evolution as yet. It's still showing a lot of the fresh grain character, and that's one of the really interesting things about old grains. This is still, in grain terms, pretty young. Palate. Now I'm getting some of that lovely dried fruit coming through on the finish. Again, pretty crisp, grainy, fresh, intense, a little bit of white fruit, lovely nutty vanilla kind of coming through on the finish, and then the alcohol comes back and adds that sort of slight spiciness, or kind of emphasises the slight spiciness. Then that little bit of dried fruit as well, moderately long, you know, not sort of like mega long, but lovely, crisp, interesting, and a really nice start, a really good introduction into sort of, you know, the character of grain whiskey. So so yeah, nice starter. And moving on 2 years, let's see what the nose gives us on this then, shall we? Now this is a slightly heavier spirit, slightly oilier, slightly denser, a little bit more oak character, a little bit more nutty, almond, sort of almond paste. Only a touch of dried fruit. Again, we're not sort of really into the sort of the dried fruit kind of evolution of the spirit as yet. There's still a little bit of freshness in the background, a little bit of citrus. Oh, that's got some real depth to it. I mean, there is a little bit of almost biscuity character coming through. I mean, that shows you, which is on a spirit of 27 years old, still a bit of biscuitiness. I mean, what? I'm really getting some real cereal character coming out now. Sort of, it's kind of in amongst that sort of biscuity kind of note. That sort of slightly heavier cereal. It's certainly not barley. Possibly maize, maybe corn. It's certainly got the heaviness that you would associate with corn, even if it was distilled in a column still. Lovely oak character, really robust, oily, dense. This is a lovely spirit. Palate. Oh, that's got a kick on the finish. Lovely spiciness and touch of banana-y kind of, almost starting to move into a rum-like fruit direction. A little bit of dried satsuma and not raisin, maybe more sultana kind of character. But again, it kicks off with probably a little bit more oak than the nose was showing, so it was a little bit more toastier, nuttier, vanilla, and then lovely freshness on the middle, just that little bit of a grainy kind of bite kind of coming through in the middle, and then we're into the slightly rummy dried fruits and that kind of character on the finish, a little bit of spice as well. Mouth-watering, really nice. I mean, not hugely alcoholic, 56.7, but enough to just sort of like elevate the spices and get your mouth watering. I mean, that is absolutely fantastic. Lovely oiliness, full, robust kind of character. That's a damn fine grain whiskey. That's all I can say. Right, and moving on to the 35-year-old. Let's see what a few more years has done to it. Let's see what those good as. Now we're back to the lighter style again. Now we're getting a lot of high-toned, rummy kind of fruits, dried apricot, orange, but I'm getting quite a heavy wood char, but not a lot of vanilla. I'm getting a lot of wood smoke, almost peat smoke. I mean, this is just unbelievably good. Really earthy, smoky, tobacco-y. But then I'm getting a lovely, slightly violety, bemory kind of character kind of coming through. That sort of violety, oaky kind of notes. Wow, that's good. I like that. That's impressive. That's got a lot going on for it. It's just, yeah, again, like with all grain whiskies, it is all about the oak. And if you were using, you know, good quality oak casks, then you know you're going to get this development of character. Almost a slight petrol-y note as well. Oh, this is a completely different beast to the last two, and it just goes to show how different grain whiskey can be. Certainly from even from each other. I mean, this is just remarkably different. Palate. That is amazingly good. Quite heavy and oily, but at the same time it's got a lightness and an elegance to it. Lots and lots of nutty charred oak, wood smoke, and then on the mid palate you're getting into this oxidised fruit character, and almost kind of old Riesling like, you know, with a slight petroliness, and white fruits and oxidised white fruits. Bit of spice on the finish, oily, cigar smoke, tobacco, leather. God, that is a really interesting mouthful. Wonderful progression, great concentration, brilliant length. I mean, that is stunningly good. And you know, I can't remember what that would have retailed for back in 3 years ago, but I would guess probably about what 90 odd quid maybe, and you could spend that sort of money on a single malt and get an awful lot less complexity in it and character, and tell you that for a start. So oh, that was good. That was very, very good. Right, okay, so let's move on 1 year. This is the 36-year-old. Let's see what the nose gives us on this then, shall we? Again, this is a sort of fairly heavy spirit, fairly oily. Not a great deal of oak actually. This is more spirit kind of character, more oily, dried fruits, almost kind of like some old barley. Touch of smoke, cereal. I mean, it has got obviously some vanilla oak, some supporting notes from the cask. Maybe a touch of coffee as well, licorice. Ah, now the oak's coming out. Give it a bit of time, and it's now starting to become quite bourbony, very American. So obviously, American oak. Surprise, surprise. Possibly not quite as complex as the previous one, the 35, but still really deep, really chunky, but elegant as well. Yeah, some wood smoke, quite a lot of charry oak now. Palate. Well, that's got a real grippy finish, real grippy, spicy finish. Quite a lot of wood notes, wood char, a little bit of licorice, wood smoke, bit of bittering right at the very finish as well. The oak has really sort of quite got to the spirit on this one, it has to be said. I mean, it starts off quite nicely, quite oily, quite dried fruit, a little bit of rummy-like kind of character, but the oak has really got to that on the finish, and it is quite bitter. And I'm not getting sort of some bitter chocolate or coffee or kind of. I'm just getting bitter wood. And I guess at the end of the day, like any spirit, this is always going to be a risk you run when you leave it in the wood for such a long period of time that sometimes the oak will overly bitter the spirit. As you know, it kind of like in the initial phases of maturation in cask will be subtractive, so it'll be removing the impurities, and then it starts to add vanillins and those kind of characters back in. But there is a point at which where the oak will just sort of like overly do it, and it will start to bitter a little bit. Yes, you'll get a little bit of that sort of, like I said, bit of chocolate, bit of coffee, but you have to be careful that that it doesn't go a little bit too far. And I think, although I'm not saying this has got an OTT on the bitterness, it just had a little bit too much bitterness, I think, right on the finish. And certainly I think the 35-year-old, the previous sample, was just a better all-round bottling. But certainly there was nothing wrong with that, bar that slightly overly bitter finish. But yeah, nice. Right, let's stick another 4 years on the clock, and let's see what this 40-year-old has got in store then, shall we? God, it's just very dense, very oily, almost kind of closed in on itself. Heavy banana oils. A lot of sweet oak, sweet vanilla, toffee. kind of starting to sort of come out of its shell a little bit now, but it's quite closed in on itself, it has to be said. I mean, it's got a lovely density, but not an awful lot of fragrance. I'm not getting a huge amount of dried fruits. I'm just getting a lot of kind of dense oak. Yeah, it's not really showing a huge amount. I mean, I can't remember what it was like when I first tasted it. I'd have to check my notes on that, but at the moment it does seem to have kind of gone in on itself a little bit. It's certainly nowhere near as effusive, shall we say, as the previous couple of bottlings. But I mean, it's not a bad whiskey at all. It's just sort of, again, you know, the way of these things. It's spent 40 years in a cask, you know, and as we know, sort of maturation is not an exact science. It's, you know, can sort of throw you a bit of a curveball. There's a bit of gingery spice kind of coming through now, but this is really quite heavy and oily, like I said. I mean, it's a lovely nose, don't get me wrong, and I guess tasted in you know, on its own, it would come across as you know, an impressive bottling, because it has got a lot of depth to it. But in this present company, it's kind of, you know, been shown up a little bit by certainly by the 35-year-old. But that's a lovely palate though. It kicks off with sort of lots of kind of almost Jamaican-y banana, a little bit maybe banana bready possibly, butter, a little bit of cocoa powder, little bit of bittering on the finish, but not as much as say the previous bottling. Some dark chocolate, a little bit of vanilla. I think the palate is a lot more impressive than the nose. It certainly has a more lightness of touch, shall we say, a little bit more elegance. It's not quite as closed in and sort of oily as the nose would lead you to believe. Yeah, I think that palate is really, really well balanced. I mean, you know, it certainly doesn't taste like a 40-year-old spirit, it has to be said, but it shows a little bit more maturity than, say, the 36. But, yeah, that's nice. Right, okay, before we get to the final bottling, I just would like to say a big thank you to Hunter Laing for all of these samples. I mean, obviously they didn't send them all in one go. You know, as you know, I get my little box every month with, you know, new releases, and you know, sometimes they're generous enough to put in some of the more expensive bottlings, the 50-year-olds and the extra old particulars, and you know, all that. No, hang on, no, they don't do that. Hang on. Start again. That's Douglas Laing. Oops. Right. Okay. So let's move on to the 50-year-old. Before we get to tasting this, you know, just a big thank you to Hunter Laing for the continued support and sample sending, and every little month I get my little box full of goodies, shall we say, some of which are incredibly tempting and I buy them, and some of them are incredibly tempting and I'm going, oh, I want to buy that but I've got no room. And sometimes you think, well, it's just the wrong time of the month, you know, or the wrong part of the year. It's just too quiet. I can't afford to buy 3 50-year-old bottles of whiskey, you know. It's but anyway, I kind of digress. But anyway, like I said, I mean, these obviously don't turn up all in one go. They come every month. But anyway, let's taste this one and see what this gives us then, shall we? Oh, that is a lovely nose. That is, again, I'm guessing this is column still. It's quite light, it's elegant, it's delicate. The oak is just wonderfully dusty and mature. A little bit of violets coming through. but sort of slightly higher toned violets, not the sort of slightly oilier Bamori kind of violets that we found in the 35-year-old. Toasted nuts, hazelnuts, almond, dried fruit, a little bit of brandy butter, no, not brandy butter, but butter, alcohol infused butter, oh wow, complex, bit of vanilla, a little bit of toffee, chocolate, white chocolate possibly, well no, milk chocolate, not white chocolate, milk chocolate, oh wow, a little bit of coffee, wow, this is really, really complex. And this, I mean, yes, this wouldn't have been cheap. I mean, 50-year-old spirits never are going to be cheap. But if you sort of put it in the context of 50-year-old single malt, they're a fraction of the price, and you are getting such an incredibly good deal, it has to be said. A little bit of sawdust. Not getting any kind of tobacco-y or sort of charred sort of wood smoke. It's very clean oak. It's very dusty, wonderfully mature. But it's just that grain spirit just still has that lightness, and even at 50 years of age, this could just keep going and going and going, I imagine. But again, it's possible that the oak might get to it, by the time it gets to sort of 60 or 70. You never know. I mean, it'd be interesting to know whether Hunter Laing actually have any 50-year-old casks that they're monitoring and sort of going to release at a later date. But wow, this is a seriously good nose. Palate. God, I didn't want to swallow that. Smooth, slightly honeyed on the finish. A little bit of cocoa powder kind of coming in, a little bit of chocolate, a little bit of dark chocolate. But again, elegant, relatively light, slightly higher toned dried fruits, dusty, mature oak. Like I said, a little bit of honey, white fruits, nuts. Really long, not hugely spicy in actual fact. Again, like I said, there's not a lot of sort of wood char or wood smoke or wood spice. It's a lot more vanilla orientated, a lot more of the sort of lighter wood kind of notes kind of coming through. Elegant dried fruits, so long, that is just incredibly good. I mean, that is 41.2%, just absolutely perfect. Right, okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show. It's blown me away, it has to be said. I was hoping this was going to be a really interesting episode of the show, and I think I was kind of proved right. I mean, I know you guys kind of watching and going, I want to taste those, but it's a dirty job and not everybody can do it. So so the 25-year-old, I mean, that was still relatively young, still a nice introduction. I mean, yes, all right, it's going to cost you a few pennies because it's 25 years old, but certainly nowhere near the 25-year-old malt. And maybe you could argue that it was a little bit light, but it was really quite pleasant. The 27-year-old, again, showed a little bit more depth, a little bit more character. The 35-year-old, to be honest with you, of the sort of the under 50s, shall we say, was certainly the pick of the bunch. I just had so much going on in it, so much wood notes and char and smoke, and wow, that was really, really complex. 36-year-old, again, pleasant. I think the palate was a lot better, or showed a lot more intensity than the nose. The nose was all a bit closed in, a bit sort of oily and a bit, just kind of like let itself down, shall we say, in this kind of company. 40-year-old, again, really, really good. You know, lovely whiskey, nice maturity. Certainly got no issues with that one at all. And the 50-year-old was absolutely sublime. I mean, really good. And just goes to show, you know, that the Port Dundas distillery was making some really interesting stuff. And you know, it's a shame that they closed it down. I mean, I think I read at one point that Diageo were saying, yeah, we're going to keep it open. Yeah, we're going to sell it off possibly. You know, and then suddenly it's like, no, we're closing it. Oh look, it's been demolished. You know, and it's kind of like, you know, these are not small distilleries. You know, these employ a lot of people. And yes, all right, you can argue that Diageo had. Or has, you know, two other grain distilleries plus a half share in North British, I think, or something like that. So they've got, you know, obviously the capacity, and maybe it needed an awful lot of money spent on it. Maybe it needed sort of modernisation. I mean, it had been through modernisation programs in its past, and maybe it was just a case of, well, it's just going to take far too much money. We may as well build a brand new, big, whopping great distillery, you know, somewhere else. So who knows? I mean, it's a shame. It's always a shame when distilleries close. And I guess at the end of the day, that sort of, you know, grain distilleries are not exactly pretty little things to look at. You know, they're great hulking, great beasties of an industrial building. So no one's going to sort of like look at it and go, "It's a shame. That was a nice looking building, wasn't it?" The shame is obviously more for the jobs and things like that. With the amount of people that are employed at these kind of places. But anyway, I'm digressing here. So I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode of the show. I don't seem to have an awful lot of whiskey left, but so all that's left to say is I hope you enjoyed it. Good dramming and good afternoon.